Those of you who may have observed the recent G20 meeting in India, you may have seen a different approach that India took, which was how can the global South work more closely with the global North in dealing with global issues? And this unique approach is something that Dr. Chaturvedi and the other planners for the G20 pioneered to ensure the success of this very unusual meeting. Dr. Chaturvedi will speak about that, how this meeting came about, what were the open issues as a result of this meeting as the transition takes place to Brazil, and how the global North and global South can be more effectively engaged in solving our common problems. Dr. Chaturvedi is the Director General of the Research and Information System think tank in New Delhi. He has been a guest speaker. He's been a visiting professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's been an advisor to the UN, the OECD, UNESCO, World Food Organizations, and a number of other groups. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Chaturvedi for his comments and his insights on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Krishen, for a very generous introduction. I would just like to add that I was also Global Justice Fellow with
at Macmillan
in
Center.
2009 and 10. So association goes back. And I think this is an excellent program, I would say, to bring in you the issues that are related to access, equity, and inclusion. So I think Global Justice Fellowship is an excellent addition to our academic landscape to bring in dimensions of bringing in equity in all the kind of policy issues that we are dealing with. And as you rightly mentioned, the G20 presidency has tried to bring in the huge list of 83 paragraphs that are there, various dimensions of this access, equity, and inclusion. And they are spread across on different fronts, trying to bring in dimensions of several intricate issues where the global governance of financial aspects of our economy, the macroeconomic disequilibrium, which we are ending up with, the structural transitions that we are talking of, the deceleration and sustainable development goals that we are discussing, or even for that matter, indebtedness of several LDCs and developing countries that we are talking about. So that way, I think the whole focus of the G20 presidency, you would find bring in all different dimensions. The big challenge is how to turn this into action. What are the ways, agreements of the heads of states, leadership, how do we turn that into action? And for that, I think it would be pertinent to go back to see where the drawing started from, who all were on the drawing board and how it evolved. And that, I think, would be important. And as Krishen, you very rightly alluded to, some of us who were involved in the process of evolution of the Global South, much before the summit happened in September, Prime Minister engaged with 125 countries of the Global South who were not sitting on the table. And this is the first step after India took over on 1st of December to bring in the Global South. So on 12th and 13th of January, we had what we called as Voice of Global South. And all these 125 countries expressed their issues, their concerns with global governance. And according to them, how this should be done. So the two-day conference was divided into exactly the way G20 works. So we had the finance track, we had the Sherpa track, we had tracks that were related to mobilization of resources, management of the debt crisis, and also trying to bring in issues which were related to cost for countries to access capital. And the fragmentation of finance, SDG-aligned finance, green finance, you name it, and the classification exists, but the cost of accessing credit goes up. So how do we address that? all countries expressed their desire, their willingness to address it. And this then was picked up during the negotiations throughout the year. The negotiations were not easy, they were very patchy, things were not moving. But after July onwards, countries realized the importance of bringing in actors. And that's when Prime Minister wrote to bring in African Union. And some of us from academics who were trying from inside also came out in open. With Thomas, we could write a policy brief and circulated it very widely to include African Union in the G20. And then government went public, Prime Minister wrote to all heads of state, and fortunately at the G20 summit, African Union was included. And with that, the share of G20 countries with GDP increased only 3%. So in terms of monetary gain for G20, it was only 3%. But then we could bring in 29% of the global population back in our fold. So you can imagine the bandwidth that has come in for governance, the bandwidth that has come in to get people included in the process of G20 umbrella. The issue here now is to what extent the G20 has given new processes that are important for economic development. And there are 4 dimensions that I want to capture here as we are talking about the structural transitions that are coming in. The first and foremost is the new lease of life that has been given to countries like Zambia, Ghana, Sri Lanka, where debt crisis has actually bulldozed many of their macroeconomic frameworks. So how do we go forward? And I would say, all countries played a very important, very constructive role in terms of overcoming the blame game, which was on for long in terms of who is not cooperating and identifying countries that were not cooperating. Fortunately, we could overcome that. And at least for these set of countries, we could bring in new governance mechanisms, new commitment, and fresh space for the national governments to do the negotiations, come up with plans. And as you might have seen, actions are rolling out for Sri Lanka. Already $125 million first installment and total commitment of $2.5 billion has already come on table. So you are realizing the action for Zambia. Committees have already been constituted by IMF. For Ghana, similar is being worked out. So you find that quick actions are coming in. In fact, India also announced a closing summit, which is also unusual. Later this month, before we pass on the presidency to Brazil, there would be another summit at the head of the state level to report back what actions have already been initiated out of the 83 paragraphs that are there, and 69 actionable points in those paragraphs. What action is coming in? There was also a commitment that was made by Prime Minister on 12th of January at the Voice of the Global South Summit to host a center in India to share excellence that is there for economic development. And Thomas, you would be glad to know that we have been given the responsibility to host this center, and we are going to get it established at RIS. It would be called as a Global South Center of Excellence, where India would share India's excellence in economic development, social development, institutional development with fellow developing countries. And this center would be inaugurated in next 2 weeks by the Prime Minister at the second Voice of the Global South Summit. And we are going to discuss issues where institutional approaches of the Global South, economic strategies of the Global South, how we can learn from each other. Processes like digitalization, how technology can help in better governance of the institutions, of the programs, bring in greater mechanisms to avoid leakages, and get rid of corruption-related practices which are prevalent in several southern economies because of lack of checks and balances. So, from that perspective, or even sheer SDG perspective for water purification, simple technologies that are there, health challenges if they are there, what kind of pooling of resources, etc., are possible, even for issues which are related to ocean governance. Some of the healthy practices can be shared among countries. So, this center of excellence would bring in dimensions. At this point, we have chosen three sectors of agriculture, health, and digital solutions. So, how we can reduce the cost of transaction for countries? How do we bring in greater digitalization in health and agriculture for enhanced access to several facilities, including telemedicine and things like that? So that portfolio is being worked out at this point. I'm traveling to a couple of countries, but more we are connecting online with think tanks, research institutions, and trying to bring in a framework for this. The third point that I want to mention is in terms of the strategies that Global South requires. So, Global South, after Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, all the four countries have major domestic challenges. They also have institutional preparedness. And as a result, the OECD countries can do research and come back on the G20 table, but the other countries from the South do not have an OECD. So, how do we collate research at a level where comprehensive policy responses are there on table from side of the developing countries? And for that, institutionalization or creation or even establishment of an OECD-like structure is not possible. So it has been decided that the global southern economies would have coalition of researchers, and this research network of the global south that has also been launched during the G20 summit. This research network would bring in researchable issues like Brazil has identified inequality, Brazil has identified sustainability as key issues of concern for the current dispensation and as their priority for the G20. And we are going to provide some research-based inputs that they have asked for. And our research network is already in touch with the Think 20, the T20 that is coming up in partnership with three institutions. We are in close touch and we are working out the details with Brazil. And similarly, some of the researchers from South Africa are also involved. So we are going to take that forward. The fourth point that I want to mention, Krishen, is more in terms of how do we bring in issues which are related to the pandemic fund that was established and announced in Indonesia. During Indian presidency, a call for papers to medical professionals for operationalization of the fund, the guidelines that are to be issued, the functioning of the fund, which is to be ensured, and the research proposals that have to come in. That call, fortunately, could go. So this presidency also marked some of the action-oriented dimensions. And for that, I would like to compare back after the evolution of the G20 from the US summit to South Korea. So when in 2008 we all met in the US with our finance ministers and central bank governors and scaled it up at the head of the state level, South Korea was the country in 2010 which added the development pillar. And they emphasized that until and unless we bring in solutions to development challenges, no solutions for finance can come in. So all financial crisis redressal mechanisms have to come from the root of development challenges being adequately addressed. And since then, G20 added the Sherpa track, and we got development issues on table. France was the first country which shaped agriculture-related challenges in 2011. And since then, all countries have contributed, all different dimensions. Change happened with Japan's presidency when Japan, for the first time, got finance and health together. And they said the ministers for health and finance should work together to bring in solutions. And this, Krishen, now is being followed by different countries in their own presidential priorities. But of course, Troika works. So during the G20 presidency, one important point, and that's my fifth and the last point, that came in is a new development approach that has been proposed by India. And this is of the lifestyle for sustainable development. This is more about individual responsibility, but it is also about collective responsibility. And fortunately, again, with Thomas and with 22 other colleagues, we had an opportunity of shaping the conceptual framework of life. And there, we wanted to bring in a new development paradigm where there is a role for trust. How do we bring in trust in the process? The focus of the G20 presidency was, of course, on our future coming in from our idea of one world and one family. So that dimension we emphasized with India's own philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, world as one family, but also bringing in Brazil's focus on Sumek Kojai, which also means welfare for all, or South Africa's Ubuntu. So from that point of view, we nurtured the process by focusing on how individuals can amend their lifestyle to reduce carbon footprint and how do we bring in change. And that's where the resistance from several OECD countries, developed countries led by the US, came in for almost with the idea that our lifestyle is not for grab. So this idea of suggesting that global south cannot think of the same lifestyles that we have, and this change of industrial development accomplishments that the countries have cannot be changed. And from that point of view, the debates that are there on decentralized globalization or decentralized financing, they are not going to go very far. And this continued for some time in terms of how a competition-based development model has come in, and to what extent we can have other alternative strategies come in. And that's where, Krishen, the idea was largely proposed through LIFE at IFE in terms of human-centric development model, where we bring in space for all other species, we bring in space for the dimensions of engagement, where larger global community can come together to see that there is space for everyone. And this is where a lifestyle for sustainable development comes in. The other component of this comes in from challenges the global business community is facing, and that is the crisis of ethics. And that's where the lifestyle for sustainable development nudges. It emphasizes in terms of how access, equity, and inclusion can be ensured when we think of values, when we think of the concept of sustainability, and when we think of integrity, and we connect finance, technology with ethics, equity, and then, of course, inclusion. So the norms, the values, the principles, the cultural ethos, they all come in one go with larger issues which are related to social justice, the nature of institutions, and the kind of well-being we think of. In this, if you see the declaration of the G20, you find 5 paragraphs which are related to these 3 dimensions of social justice, institutions, and well-being. And that's where at times we had discussions on dichotomy of ethics and values, whose values and whose ethics we are talking about. So those discussions were largely in terms of communities, as Agenda 2030 says, localization, and of course, the individual responsibilities. And then we had huge debates in terms of how post-Kant philosophy of individualism comes in, how Global South talks more about community, and Western countries talk more about individual rights and their lifestyles. Those kind of discussions, interests and norms, etc. And even the debate covered what very often we hear from Thomas in terms of global tax havens and the ideas of illicit financial flows. So things were getting linked in this, but the most important part of life economy is about SCP, sustainable consumption and production, which actually brought in the idea of Thailand's sufficiency economy, of bringing in sustainability in the consumption and also bringing in circularity of economy. The other important dimension where example of the United States came in was about the social enterprises, something that Mahatma Gandhi called as trusteeship. So how companies which are motivated by social objectives, they can bring in social impact bonds, or they can bring in legal frameworks which are there for protection. The solution for intellectual property rights and the impact funds, they were also discussed. They were also part of the discussion papers that were circulated. The last point here is in terms of measurement, in what way we can measure it. And that's where the recent call by the UN Secretary General for well-being, so going beyond GDP, to bring in what Partho Dasgupta in his report to UK Treasury said in terms of going beyond GDP, to bring in well-being, bring in biodiversity, bring in access to clean water, and issues like that. So that part of discussion came in a major way, and got addressed in terms of identifying the sort of stakeholders for a concept like life, bringing in sort of dimensions of rationality, responsibility, and also nature of review that is needed. So from that perspective, if you see a large component of India's G20 presidency, not only ensured specific action plan which have their own trajectories over next few years, as the southern presidencies continue, but it could also provide an alternative development paradigm which has to be explored. In fact, before we pass on the presidency on 26th to 28th of this month, we are doing a conference in New Delhi on life economy. We are also coming out with a volume where we have 22 papers now to explore this concept further, and bring in more suggestions in terms of how individual responsibilities are to be addressed. And when we say lifestyle, it is to be addressed not only by individuals alone. It also has to be addressed by the institutions, as I said earlier. And that's where we need IMF and the World Bank and the other financial institutions to see that their credit creating ability is leveraged for the best outcomes. The nature of free trade agreements that we have done, they have promoted a pollution hypothesis to a great extent, where industries have shifted, and pollution creating products have seen precedence in their export markets. So this kind of issue, I think, is important. It is also important to address the historical roots of ecological crisis that we are ending up with, and how Global South is affected. So, in brief, this was my idea of how the G20 presidency has addressed. I'm sure there might be a couple of points which I might have missed out, but then this is what largely is in my mind that I wanted to capture. So thanks, Krishen, for this opportunity.
No, this is a very good overview, and before I turn it over to our audience for questions, using the privileges of the moderator, let me ask one question, Dr. Chaturvedi. India has also played a leading role in the BRICS, in addition to the G20. As you know, the recent meeting of BRICS in Johannesburg involved 6 new members that were admitted. Where do you see, if you were a country, if you were, let's say, a small country in Latin America, Bolivia or Honduras, or you were a country in Africa, say Kenya or Nigeria, or you were a country in South Asia, say Sri Lanka or Nepal, if they look to their future, do they see their future more in terms of what G20 and its deliberations and its opportunities can do for them? Or would it be the BRICS countries and the opportunity for financing and manufacturing that those countries can provide? How do you place both these major institutions into place for the global South that is looking for a better future for themselves? Do you see, and India playing a leading role in both, how do you see either the G20 or the BRICS meeting the needs of these countries who are looking for major structural change for a better future for their young people?
Thank you. Thanks, Krishen. I think it's a brilliant question. Fortunately, I was in Cape Town at the BRICS Summit, and I attended the expansion ceremony that was there and the new countries that were added to BRICS community. As you can imagine, with geopolitics that is on, polarization has happened. And BRICS versus G7 is a very clear case that is there before us. And this is nothing but boiling down to China and the US rivalry, which is on for last couple of years. We are also seeing this now getting manifested through the regional groupings like the BRICS. We are seeing that through G20. And we see very difficult choices for smaller countries, but they are trying to play best diplomatic role that they can do in terms of and remaining non-aligned with the groups, but also having multiple alliances and trying to see best advantages that are possible by being with whatever group they can get their national challenges adequately addressed. This is also important for us to realize that the cost of capital sometimes is absolutely mind-boggling for several countries of the global south, while it may be very, very low for the OECD members or even G7 members. So there were a couple of examples of Germany paying only 2% rate of interest on accessing X amount of capital, while Ghana and Cambodia are paying 8 to 9% for the same amount of capital. So this kind of inequity in access to capital is something that G20, that BRICS are trying to address. BRICS, through the new development bank, is trying to create more avenues for access. And as you might have already noticed, this is expanding. China is more aggressive in promoting AIIB for facilitating similar access. So BRICS and G20 are trying to go in different directions. Fortunately, there are countries which are trying to play the bridging role, trying to bring in triangular cooperation right up front for this. And I'm sure India would continue to play this role of bringing BRICS and the West together, and do not allow BRICS to become a platform for anti-West discourse. And this is where I think our role would be absolutely crucial, not only to take care of the many other countries of the global South, but also remain connected with the current institutional frameworks which are there at the global level.
Great, thank you, thank you. More questions from the group. Yes, Thomas.
I wanted to ask something a little bit delicate, and that is countries are not homogeneous, right? So countries, especially those in the global south, have very different constituencies within them. India is well known for its billionaires. It's also well known for still having large numbers of people that are quite poor. And so what I wanted to ask you about is how these different interests get negotiated in the process of the South developing a kind of common position that it takes. India, of course, as a leader of the South, is articulating proposals and has a certain convening role, certainly had this role this year. And there is competition between the things that one can push. One can only push so much. Some things may be good for the Indian exporters, for example. Other things may be good for India's poor. And by things here, I mean institutional reform projects, particular initiatives and changes that the G20 might consider and want to initiate. So what I want to ask you is basically, how have you experienced these competing pressures? And can one sort of say something in general about how governments of the global south are deciding these tricky questions insofar as there is competition? Should we sort of rather try to enhance our GNP and our exports and our rich big companies, or should we rather try to push for issues that protect our rank and file majority of not so well-to-do people?
Thank you, Thomas. I think, as I said, the efforts this time were made in terms of taking the growth parameters beyond GDP. So how we bring in well-being as a measure was something that was discussed. India, with the Prime Minister's address, a couple of times highlighted the issue of human-centric development and trying to bring in space for many others. So not just on economic growth, but development component that was discussed. The plurality of perspectives is evident, not only the countries of the global south that are in position to share and provide, but also among the recipients. They also have fractions where some countries want to push in, like for instance in Sri Lanka, people wanted to push in for promoting tourism, quickly restoring those sectors which are money minting. They may be good for individuals, but also good for economy. Similarly, you find quarters in India who would be interested more in terms of business opportunities, and some were more interested in connecting with larger developing countries on resolving socioeconomic challenges. Within South, within the providers, China's strategy may be very different, and approach within G20 would be very different from what India is trying to propose, or even India capable of providing that kind of support. So those dimensions of divergences, they were absolutely discernible all across the year. And had they continued to that extent, we won't have come up with declaration at all. It was largely at the head of the state level at the end that things prevailed, crystallized, and got focused in terms of how we address these diversities in some coherent, cogent manner for bringing the document in. And that's where the document got finalized, and some strategies, but still divergences are there, which would have their own shadow on the implementation plan. An implementation plan then would have to resurrect the larger commitments from dominating groups. And that's where I see these 69 recommendations that I mentioned would be difficult to achieve, because all different fractions would pull them in all different directions, not only among the providers, but also among the recipients. And then imagine more than a dozen global institutions are involved in this process, which have their own bureaucratic inertia. So it is not going to be very easy, but I think so far so good. We have got documents, we have got details with us, and as we crystallize our thought process, as we bring in dimensions of engagement on table, probably academics, research community would have to collate these details together, analyze them in such a manner that we can create the global pressure, exactly like the one that we created on bringing African Union in, bring in influential voices and present the cases at least to extent where more dimensions of them can be accommodated. For Brazil, it would be easier, where civil society plays a very important role. Inequality is already identified by President Lula as a priority area. Sustainability is already identified, and triangular cooperation. So working with North and with South is identified. So what BRICS is trying to become as anti-West, Brazil, India, South Africa probably would walk like a centrist power and would try to bring in both together in the process. And that, I think, would give a huge line of traction for continued cooperation.
Great. More questions from our audience, from our group. Dr. Chaturvedi, while people are thinking about the question, let me ask one that is quite a bit on my mind. If you look at the future of the G20, it was interesting that even though the India meeting was a great success, the world's largest trading partner was not at the meeting, which is China. And the world's perhaps largest supplier of energy and food, which is also important for the Global South, was not at the meeting. Now, if I was a Global South country, to me, it's very important. Trade, financing, energy, and food are the four biggest parameters. If the leading countries that are providers of these resources are not at the G20, does that cast a shadow on the future sustainability of G20? And if so, are there some efforts to ensure a more inclusive world in which these two countries can participate in the deliberations of the G20 so that it can be more holistic in terms of both the audience of actors who are in the room and the actors who are not in the room, who could be helped by their participation?
The premier was there, Li Qiang was there from China, and China was represented even if President Xi Jinping was not there. And I don't think if any points from China were missed out at any session. They spoke as much as everybody else. They participated in all these sessions and all the panels that were planned out. They took all the slots that were reserved for President Xi Jinping. So I do not think if they were not there at the table. They were very much there, and they participated.
And Lavrov was there. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So Putin's absence in BRICS or even in G20 was adequately compensated by the foreign minister. I think the point that you are trying to make is in terms of the leadership's absence and some lack of sort of traction with their perspectives and bringing in the dimensions of engagement that are necessarily there. I agree with you, because the leadership has to be involved. Leadership has to have that faith in the process. And that's where the collective part comes in. But as Thomas was mentioning, the divergences are there, the angularities are there, which we cannot overlook. And even with that, if countries agree and come up with a roadmap which has support of everyone, then I think it's a great accomplishment.
Yes, thank you. I think Matteo has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The question I have is a very, very general one. I was just wondering, at such a meeting, how central or how much or is the adherence to human rights as a concept, or like something actually states agree on, right? Discussed, or how central is the question of human rights?
I would say that this is quite important in terms of how we look at the issues that are significant in terms of identifying the development and growth strategies, even if these words are not uttered. The respect and as I said in the beginning of equity and inclusion, they are very much part of that from the economic perspective of human rights. But largely, as you would appreciate, both BRICS and G20, I would say, have predominantly development and finance perspective. So social dimensions come in a very limited manner, and as you would see, they are more generic in nature. But the two groups which are exclusively responsible for bringing in some of the dimensions that are associated with human rights, they actually met, and they have given the report. If you see the G20 declaration, there are references in terms of how those groups reports which were attached with the declaration, they were mentioned, but no explicit reference to human rights per se.
Great. We are reaching the end of the hour, and I really want to thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi, for meeting with us on such, your schedule is very tight. You flew into Dhaka today and then joined us right away from the hotel. So on behalf of the Global Justice Program, I want to thank you for participating. And now I turn it over to you, Thomas, for the next segment of the program.
Very good, Krishen. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sachin. This was wonderful. And thank you for making time so late in your day. And I wish you a good night's rest and all good luck for tomorrow.